The project proposes a territorial mapping system and a set of architectural markers that act as a tool for indigenous communities of Argentina to record and bring visibility to their traditional knowledge and practices of land use, with the broader aim of changing the predominant concept of territory into Terra Communis, land shared by all.
¿Es vuestra primera vez en la Patagonia?
Sí, es la primera vez que vinimos como turistas para experimentar la vida en una estancia local. Oh, ¿qué es este extraño objeto en el campo?
Es un marcador de sendero.
¿Marcador de sendero?
Sí, marca la ruta que siguen las comunidades indígenas mapuches durante la transhumancia. La transhumancia es una práctica estacional. Todos los veranos los mapuches trasladan su ganadería a las zonas altas en busca de mejores lugares de pastoreo. Por cierto, hemos llegado a vuestro destino. Bienvenidos a la estancia. Estancia es el nombre de un rancho en América Latina. Aquí en la Patagonia suele referirse a las granjas de ovejas especializadas en la producción de lana. Todo el territorio de la estancia abarca miles de hectáreas e incluye un conjunto de edificios y pastizales que los rodean. En el centro de todo el complejo se encuentra el sector productivo con sus instalaciones, donde se realiza la esquila de las ovejas. Los vaqueros locales se llaman gauchos, viven y trabajan en la estancia cuidando las ovejas. Ahora vamos a acompañar a los gauchos para ver más de cerca cómo se hace el pastoreo de ovejas.
¿Todos estos pastoreos forman parte de la estancia?
Sí, todo el territorio está vallado como propiedad privada.
¿Pero por qué en esta parte no hay vallas, sino altos pilares?
Estos marcan el lugar donde el sendero de migración de mapuche cruza nuestro territorio. Este camino fue establecido por sus antepasados. Sin embargo, desde el establecimiento de la estancia, el camino quedó bloqueado por la valla. Tras largas negociaciones hemos acordado retirarla y restablecer la circulación indígena por el territorio. Y a los turistas siempre les parecen fascinantes estas marcas, así que hemos organizado visitas guiadas para verlas.
¿Y qué es esa estructura en forma de verja?
Es un elemento de vigilancia, diseñado para permitir el paso libre de las personas pero impedir que lo cruce el ganado. De este modo, los indígenas pueden entrar en la estancia para recoger hierbas o bayas, mientras nosotros podemos seguir pastoreando nuestras ovejas sin que se escapen accidentalmente del territorio. Y esa marca a lo lejos indica en realidad una zona donde los indígenas recolectan ciertas plantas. El año pasado, cuando los mapuches veraneaban cerca, uno de los miembros de la comunidad vino a recolectarla. Le pregunté que por qué recogía esas flores amarillas, y compartió conmigo su conocimiento de que, si se infusiona, esta planta puede utilizarse como medicina contra el resfriado.
My project began by looking at the conflict between estancias and Mapuche communities, one of the many indigenous people of Argentina. History of the conflict goes back to the Spanish colonization of Americas and the introduction of an encomienda system, a grant which allowed conquistadors to demand tribute and labor from the native population. Later it was replaced with estancias, a system which distributed vast tracts of indigenous lands to Spaniards and in which plantations, farms, and factories could be established. An important part in the legalization of this process played the concept of terra nullius, land belonging to no one. Terra nullius was used to justify conquering of southern parts of Argentina, Patagonia, which was seen as wild due to no visible signs of land management. Despite being inhabited by different indigenous nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes whose lifestyle mainly depended on hunting and gathering activities, establishing temporary settlements and practicing seasonal migrations. However, absence of permanent architecture, sedentary agriculture, or any other visible signs of landscape transformation that could demonstrate ownership allowed appropriation of indigenous lands during the conquest of the desert in 1870, which resulted in the imposition of an abstract grid over the Patagonian lands, subdividing it into rigid plots which were easy to distribute and formed latifundios, extensive parcels of privately owned lands. By the late 19th century, most of these lands belonged to estancias, which went through a rapid industrialization, adopting traits of a full-scale factory and eventually colonizing and fencing the entire Patagonia. Ever since, indigenous communities of Argentina were struggling to reclaim their ancestral lands, and that resulted in numerous conflicts across the country. Only in 1985, Argentinian government finally came to recognize the ethnic and cultural pre-existence of indigenous people and their rights to territory. However, the first step towards the exercise of their constitutional right was only made in 2006 when the emergency situation in regards to indigenous lands was recognized and Law 26.1.60 was introduced. This law prevented eviction of communities and ordered a legal and cadastral survey of their territory. It was enacted for a period of 4 years with the aim of surveying all indigenous communities inhabiting Argentina. And although it was extended 3 times, less than half of the communities were registered by 2021. The National Survey Program was developed to gather information on the situation of territorial occupation of indigenous communities throughout the country. Its main objective is to delimit lands occupied by indigenous communities. At the end of the survey, based on the collected data, a boundary is drawn to demarcate the scope of community occupation, and thus generate conditions for the implementation of the future and yet non-existent communal property law, which means assimilating the complex indigenous relationship with the land to the category of ownership and in fact reducing the scope of the actual land use, since traditional practices and patterns of mobility performed by communities extend far beyond the places of their settlement. Imposed boundary by the survey will only further promote the fragmentation of territory, which started with the introduction of its estancia system and continues to happen today with the advance of industrial and agricultural sectors, eventually leading to the loss of spaces for indigenous traditional practices and rituals to unfold. Therefore, my project is going to revise the current survey framework and propose an updated methodology that will bring a territorial scale into the picture and challenge the imposition of boundaries on the indigenous communities. I'll go through the existing document and its procedures, highlighting my changes and additions in parallel. The current stages of the survey involve first, conceptual construction of the territory, technical team carrying out the survey works together with the community members on a written narrative describing their way of life, economic, social, and cultural practices. Based on this, a sketch map is drawn. This data is then used by the technical team as a guide to measure and survey location of each object in the sketch map using GPS system. From the collected data, a set of cartographies are drawn, depending on each community's type of occupation. Elements that make up the territory are visualized on the map as symbols that were developed by the state to represent different practices. The problem of this approach is that technicians make emphasis on defining land use according to subsistence economy. This makes it easier to delimit the lands by identifying only necessary sites for community reproduction, and compromise other sites of significant importance. Therefore, I propose to transfer the task of surveying the territory to community members themselves, allowing them to keep ownership of the collected data and eliminate any attempts to categorize their practices according to the imposed governmental system. To facilitate the survey of the territory, a simple Arduino device, which incorporates GPS, will be introduced. It can be carried around to record locations with buttons corresponding to different types of activities, making the process of mapping more interactive and allowing communities to decide what needs to be recorded. The collected data will then be reinterpreted as dots of different colors to represent different practices. Unlike the current survey process, which is done only once, this will allow for information to be constantly updated, showing the overlaps of practices and how they change with time. To give an example, I've developed this map for Tubunco Palmeo community located in the province of Neuquén. One of their traditional practices is transhumance, a seasonal migration with cattle from the wintering grounds to summer pastures. The journey can take days and sometimes weeks, during which Mapuche perform trail herding, collect plants and fruits, and send temporary camps for the night. This map will become a communicative device between indigenous people and the government, suggesting a dynamic nature of inhabitation and hidden flows of land use, which will render the land as a network of mobilities rather than an asset that can be easily parceled out and fenced off. Another thing that this survey does not address is the conflicts between communities and third parties. Currently, there are cases where the parties dispute the space. A corresponding map of overlapping uses is drawn, but that doesn't resolve the problem itself. So, I'm adding a new section to the document which will address the need of bringing visibility to the indigenous practices for third parties to actually see the use of territory. I'm proposing 4 types of markers that will act as anchor points for the map in physical landscape. There are 2 types of elements to mark spaces of certain land use: trail and area markers. One is permanent and the other is transitional. These are designed as abstract objects in the field for the purpose of attracting attention and communicating a presence of a certain activity. Trail markers will follow trajectories of traditional movements, such as transhuman trails, while the area markers will identify sites of concentration of activities, such as plant or nuts collection. To address and resolve the conflicts between indigenous communities and landowners, I'm proposing a set of access markers. These are special elements designed as interventions in the existing borders of contested territories, where sites of indigenous land usage overlap with private properties. To give an example, I'll go back to Loftu in Copalmeo, which was faced with the advance of Estancia La Nevada on the Sama pasture. Owner of the estancia bought the land and fenced off the area, preventing access for Mapuche people. The guideline for resolving this type of conflict would be to first start the negotiation process between the government, community, and estancia owner, with the aim of convincing the owner to allow access or passage through the territory, through a modification or partial removal of the fence with visual marker replacement. This will promote a shared use of land which has a potential to benefit not only indigenous communities but also estancias, by first of all eliminating conflicts and usurpation of the territory, allowing for exchange of knowledge and increase of tourism activity. For the communities, this would mean recovering and preserving ancestral trails and therefore knowledge of the territory that carries a great cultural value. To conclude, my project aims to transform the predominant concept of territory as a geographical area subject to ownership, division, and control into a fluid landscape which proposes alternative ways of living and inhabiting the land, which is based on sharing and overlapping of different modes of life. Thank you.